Greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome again to Type Productions. I am your host, Khalid Muhammad, and we thank you for coming back to our channel. In part 1 and 2 of our series, The Black Vote, How Did We Get Here?, we examine the early history of the long, challenging road African Americans have endured in their quest for attaining and implementing their right to vote. We would like to present our final entry into the series as our analysis moves into the 20th century. So let's get started. Here on Each One Teach Two. As the 20th century began, it brought with it all the racial discrimination and inequities far too prevalent in the previous centuries, especially in the Democratic-controlled southern states. Agriculture continued to be a major source of revenue for these states, and most black people were relegated to farming, plantation-based labor. Several African American activists would enter the century with an objective focus upon the betterment of racial conditions in the United States. They included W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, Noble Drew Ali, and others. Their efforts, in addition to the countless numbers of lesser-known African American educators, organizers, homemakers, and early political and social activists, laid the foundation for overcoming many of the challenges of institutionalized racism and bigotry throughout both the South and the North. In many northern states, the new century ushered in the dawn of modern industrialization in what would virtually be the second U.S. industrial revolution. Factories were being built throughout the northern cities such as Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and many others. These giant factories required manpower, thus entered the Southern African American. After decades of enduring horrific racial prejudice and state-sponsored violence, the newer generation of Southern African Americans sought to alleviate this oppression by abandoning the South and seeking an improved way of life in northern states. Consequently, the Great Migration began. In what would be one of the largest voluntary relocation efforts in U.S. history, in around 1910, more than 6 million African Americans initiated a migration from the tyranny of the South and moved to northern and midwestern states where Jim Crow laws were not so prevalent. However, coinciding with this massive exodus was the re-emergence of an old adversary to all black people, the Ku Klux Klan. In 1915, a motion picture was released entitled The Birth of a Nation. It was directed by D.W. Griffith and was based upon the novel The Klansman that was written by an openly racist Baptist minister named Thomas Dixon Jr. The film's plot involved a white supremacy viewpoint of post-Civil War racial conditions. Black people were depicted in very demeaning, overly exaggerated racial stereotypes, while Caucasians were presented as pristine victims of African American progress. The major roles were performed by Caucasian men in blackface makeup, portraying the African American characters. The plot involved a post-Civil War South Carolina Caucasian woman who jumps from a cliff to avoid the advances of a black character. The Ku Klux Klan is then called upon to hunt down the black man who is subsequently murdered. A biracial lieutenant governor then orders an African American militia to avenge the death of the black man, and the militia takes control of the town. When this lieutenant governor asked an aristocratic Caucasian woman to marry him, promising to build a black empire for them to rule over, she vehemently rejects his proposal, thus adding to the racial antagonisms of the film's plot. After the militia and the black townsmen take control of the town, the Ku Klux Klan is summoned to save the poor oppressed white folks. With all the gallant theatrics Hollywood could put on film, the KKK majestically arrives to liberate the people from the black militia, and it is defeated and disarmed. The aristocratic white woman's virtue is saved from the biracial lieutenant governor, and order is restored. The army of Klansmen then assemble to prevent black men from voting, and white supremacy is reestablished once again. Sisters and brothers, although scenes from this film may seem almost comical by today's standards, the effects it had on 1915 society would prove to be monumental. Birth of a Nation would be the very first motion picture to be viewed in the White House, with President Woodrow Wilson, his family, and cabinet members attending, with both D.W. Griffith and Dixon attending. Upon public release, the social impact of the imagery of the Ku Klux Klan being depicted as heroes rescuing white people from aggressive African Americans was immeasurable. The film was a cinematic sensation throughout the country, as theaters were unable to accommodate the enormous crowds clamoring to view it. The aftermath of this motion picture caused incalculable detriment to the already fragile racial relations in the United States. The film so motivated one Baptist preacher named William Joseph Simmons that on Thanksgiving Day in 1915, he, along with 15 cohorts, climbed Stone Mountain in Georgia, lit a cross, and founded what would be the second reincarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. With the premise of the birth of a nation serving as the catalyst, membership in the Klan would rise to over 85,000 members in just 6 months, and would peak in the mid-1920s to as many as 4 million Klan members residing in all regions of the United States. The resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and the subsequent violence and discrimination it inflicted upon African Americans further motivated these black people to abandon the South and seek an improved living environment in northern states, where such violence was less prominent and voting restrictions were not institutionalized. With the First World War raging in Europe, foreign immigration was significantly decreased, thus lessening laborers in this new industrialized United States. When the United States entered the war in 1917, thousands of young men were required to join the military, thus further reducing the workforce that was needed in this ever-growing industrialization era. Whereas many African Americans did join the World War I effort, with over 360,000 enlisting in the U.S. military, the millions of migrating black Southerners greatly bolstered the Northern labor force. These African Americans were able to fill some of the manpower void created by the war's military draft. This served as a major turning point for black laborers, as these employment opportunities were outside of the agricultural-based jobs they were limited to in the South, and it included the prospect of learning skilled labor. Additionally, in the northern states, black people could vote without the impediments of Jim Crow laws and the ever-growing Ku Klux Klan. In August of 1920, all women in the United States were granted the right to vote by way of the 19th Amendment. However, this constitutional right did very little for African American women in the states where Jim Crow was the law of the land, as local laws and the threat of violent retaliation from these racist lunatics deterred black women from voting, just as it had black men previously. Now, as unsatisfactory as the living conditions in the South it was no bed of roses in the northern states either. After all, this was still the United States of America. As the troops began returning from World War I, Caucasian veterans discovered that many of the jobs that they had previously held were now occupied by African Americans. Additionally, the tens of thousands of black soldiers returning from the war elected to settle in northern states and immediately began seeking employment there, thus further diluting the job market. With the historical attitude of racial entitlement again raising its ugly head, these factors led to volatile racial tensions that would explode into what was known as the Red Summer of 1919. In the northern cities of Washington, D.C., Wilmington, Delaware, and Chicago, violent race riots broke out and hundreds of black people were viciously attacked. Over 1,000 African American homes and businesses were burned to the ground. Dozens of black people were killed, with several being lynched or burned at the stake. Similar race riots erupted throughout the country in cities such as Omaha, St. Louis, Charleston, Knoxville, and Houston, Texas, with comparable violence committed against African Americans. It would be weeks before military forces intervened and calm was reestablished. During these racially motivated riots, the African American supported Republican Party did little to address the causation of the tensions other than typical political lip service. The party's collective inertia contributed to the 1926 announcement by the NAACP that African Americans, and now that included women, should not be exclusively loyal to any political party. The effects of the Republican sellout of black people and the Compromise of 1877 was so complete that when Oscar De Priest was elected in 1929, it was the first time in 30 years that any African American would be a member of Congress. And as were all black congressmen previously, De Priest too was a Republican. In that same year of 1929, the stock market collapsed and the Great Depression began. As was the case with most national crises, African Americans found themselves at the very bottom of this economic catastrophe as unemployment rates in their communities reached levels twice that of their Caucasian counterparts. Then in 1933, Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to the presidency with promises of a New Deal to rescue the nation's financial predicament. Considering the Republican Party's decades-long indifference to the social and economic concerns of African Americans throughout the nation, Northern black voters abandoned their allegiance to the Republican Party and voted for the Democratic candidate Roosevelt. The progressive policies of the New Deal provided potential hope for all Americans, including black people, a sort of high tide raises all boats scenario. Major innovative programs were introduced that addressed banking, labor, agriculture, industry, and so forth. Slowly, the tide began to turn for the nation as unemployment was greatly reduced and commerce began to increase for all Americans. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, those African Americans who were not drafted into the military contributed to the desperately needed manpower during the war effort. As Jim Crow laws continued to infest the southern states, the prospect of employment in the North enticed even more Southern African Americans to leave the South in the search for better living conditions. Although housing and employment discrimination was quite prevalent in the North, the prejudices there paled in comparison to the brutality and disenfranchisement of systemic racism in the Jim Crow South. As the conditions in the country following the Great Depression improved, So did the economic status and job opportunities of African Americans. During these progressive times, black voters evaluated the decades long disinterest Republicans had displayed in regards to the nation's discriminatory conditions against the opportunities realized from that of the Democrats' New Deal policies. Their collective progress during a Democrat administration initiated a shift in regards to political allegiance by African American voters. Consequently, a new alliance was established between black voters and the Democratic Party, one of which continues even until today. Unlike present day politics, the dynamics of the two parties were quite different in that era. In those days, there were progressive and conservative wings of both parties. In the Democratic Party, the progressives were Northerners, generally from larger cities with highly populated urban areas. The conservative Democrats were the Southerners who supported laws such as Jim Crow, segregation, and the Black Codes, including these despicable racists. In the Republican Party, the Republicans were those who shared a similar mindset as did the Republicans of Abraham Lincoln's era. The party's conservative branch consisted of advocates of small government and states' rights, with limitations being placed on the federal government's involvement in state business. Despite being on opposite sides of the political aisle, conservative Southern Democrats and conservative Northern Republicans agreed to tolerate most of Roosevelt's sweeping federal legislations, as he did not interfere with the racial segregation policies of the Southern states. The two opposing factions agreed to reject any attempt by the government to improve the social economic situation that African Americans were enduring, and they succeeded at blocking nearly every attempt at civil rights legislation by progressive politicians. Initiating in the 1930s, these conservatives, both Republicans and Democrats, formed a contemptible coalition that would last into the 1960s, and by way of the Senate Judiciary Committee, managed to block over 100 attempts by the Senate to pass any and all versions of civil rights legislation. Comparable to the slavery-based antagonisms that led to the Civil War, an ideological battle between conservative and progressive politicians in regards to civil rights and segregation was inevitable. This political conflict came to a head in 1948 when President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 that desegregated the U.S. military. This resulted in pandemonium amongst Democrat conservatives. In a move comparable to the Democrat predecessors during the Civil War, these conservatives decided to secede from the Democratic Party and form a new political coalition called the States' Rights Democratic Party, commonly known as the Dixiecrats. These Dixiecrats would be led by a South Carolina governor named Strom Thurmond, an explicitly racist politician who held various political offices in the United States government for 70 years. Thurmond would run for president in the 1948 election against Truman and Thomas Dewey, but managed to only receive less than 3% of the vote. Yet, in spite of his pathetic performance in the elections, the political stances of Thurmond and his anti-civil rights, pro-segregation Dixiecrat cohorts gained substantial traction throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. When Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy was elected to the presidency in 1960, African Americans overwhelmingly supported his campaign in what was the highest voter turnout for Democratic presidential candidate by black people. Upon his election, tensions between the progressive and conservatives of the party substantially escalated. Southern states continued to enforce their Jim Crow laws, and severe violence against African Americans was widespread. With civil rights protests taking place throughout the nation, in February of 1963, John F. Kennedy submitted a special message to Congress on civil rights where he asked Congress to enact legislation to improve voting rights laws and initiate school desegregation. He would make his intentions public in a televised speech on June 11th of 1963, and on June 19th, he submitted a bill for a Civil Rights Act to Congress. 5 months later, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The following year, Kennedy's successor, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, ran for president against a conservative segregationist named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater's opposition to civil rights while advocating states' rights that included Jim Crow increased the rejection of the Republican Party by African American voters nationwide. Upon winning the election, Johnson and a Democratic Congress picked up where Kennedy had left off, and in July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, thus outlawing systemic segregation and all other aspects of Jim Crow. 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act was passed that banned discriminatory practices against African Americans and all other Americans who sought to exercise their constitutional right to vote. By this point, Strom Thurmond and his Dixiecrat cohorts had had enough of the Democratic Party. And in September of 1964, he abandoned the party and went from that time forward be identified as a Republican. Subsequently, many other conservative Democrats joined Thurmond and also became members of what would be viewed as a new version of the Republican Party. This represented a monumental political shift in U.S. politics, as the previously Democrat or blue states were now a stronghold for conservative or red state Republicans. The Democratic Party adopted persona of being a progressive entity, while the Republican Party adopted the philosophy of political conservatism. The ramification of this political reposition led to a showdown in the 1968 presidential election between Vice President Hubert Humphrey and former Vice President Richard Milhous Nixon. Running as an independent, third-party candidate was the openly racist proponent of segregation, Alabama Governor George Wallace. Wallace's campaign platform greatly appealed to the segregationist philosophies of Deep South citizens, thus posing a threat to Nixon's attempt to secure enough support from that region of the country in the election. Expounding upon the previously unsuccessful campaign efforts of Barry Goldwater, Nixon's strategy involved attracting Southern conservative Democratic voters to the new Republican conservative agenda. Focusing on the concerns of Caucasian Southern voters regarding the rash of racial riots and civil unrest in the nation's urban areas, Nixon ran on a law and order platform, promising to extinguish civil disorder, enforce the rule of law, and terminating all inner-city violence throughout the country. Nixon's plan consists of coaxing as many Caucasian Southern voters as possible to vote Republican, thus granting him an opportunity to win the presidency without the support of urban progressive or African American voters. This political subterfuge would become known as the Southern Strategy. In one of the closest presidential races of all time, and despite losing 5 Deep South states to Wallace, Nixon defeated Humphrey by less than 1% of the popular vote to become the nation's 37th president. Nixon's presidential policies, combined with his Southern strategy, led to his landslide victory re-election in 1972. However, 2 years later, this law and order Republican president was forced to resign from office as a result of his criminal actions in the Watergate scandals. You can Google Watergate as well as Nixon's other treasonous acts. Aspects of the Southern strategy continued into the 1980s. While campaigning, Republican presidential candidate Ronald Reagan gave a speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi's Neshoba County, wherein he advocated his endorsement of states' rights. The speech took place just a short distance where 3 civil rights advocates had been murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1960s. Reagan's choice of location for his states' rights speech was viewed as an obvious dog whistle to millions of Southern pro-segregation conservative voters who previously supported Jim Crow laws and still held strong convictions against civil rights and integration. It would be Reagan who crafted a political narrative of aggressively identifying Democrats as liberals rather than progressives in the early 1980s, thus insinuating that the Democratic Party was leaning towards socialism or even communism. It would be nearly 30 years before the term progressive would again be used by those in the Democratic Party in an attempt to deviate from the moderates who managed to seek only one Democratic president between 1968 and 1992. From the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and into the 21st century, African Americans have persistently supported the Democratic Party in elections throughout the country. Although there has been some recent disgruntlement within the Black community due to what has been viewed as political inertia by Democratic politicians, the vast majority remain overwhelmingly loyal to the Democratic Party. Such loyalty is not expected to waver in the upcoming 2024 election or any election in the future. Well, sisters and brothers, this concludes our 3-part series on the Black vote. How did we get here? We at Type Productions sincerely hope that the information contained within this series has been of some benefit to you in the broadening of your scope in regards to the history of the voting experience in the African American community and our collective involvement in this nation's political arena. As always, we thank you for taking the time to view our presentation. If you enjoy the content, please like, subscribe, and share with someone you know or love. In closing, I leave you with this. Considering that the United States government is basically a 2-party system, Democrat and Republican, the potential for political disenfranchisement can be all too real. Once a political party realizes that a faction of voters will not grant support to their platform, those in said party have no motivation to implement any policies beneficial to those voters. Consequently, when a political party realizes that any group of voters will consistently vote for their candidates without wavering, that party may operate lethargically in enacting policies beneficial to said voters, thus taking their support for granted. Far too often, this has been a circumstance in the political arena for African American voters. Holding politicians responsible for the support given to them is as important as the actual voting process itself. Politics affects every aspect of our lives in this country. It is nonsensical to dismiss its importance and collectively destructive to remain uneducated in the particulars involved in the political system of the nation in which you and your family lives. I thank you again, sisters and brothers. And until next time, may peace be upon you and all of yours.
We suggest that Negroes vote for in the coming election.
I wouldn't suggest that they vote for any party or either party. I would suggest that the so-called Negroes become politically mature, realize the power that they hold in the field of politics, and then once the person who is running is aware that this man is awakened to the power that he holds, then that person who is running will approach that Negro on a more intelligent plane. As it is right now, most of the Negro leaders sell out to the white politicians for crumbs. And a political awakening among Negroes will make it impossible for the present Negro leaders to sell our people out as they've been doing in the past.